Good morning. Happy Wednesday. I have the pleasure of introducing this next guest speaker. Excuse me, allergies. Besides being a great guy, somebody that I would live up to someday. How's that for a nice little segue? Jamie Oswald is the manager of data analytics engineering for Mercy Technology Services. He's also a very active member and leader of our user group we call ASUG. And Jamie is also part of the leadership council for the Hana Healthcare Consortium, which is a group of over 70 U.S. healthcare organizations, 29 of which are actually in production with our advanced analytic platform we call Hana. This group helps facilitate the adoption of the technology, sharing best practices, shared assets, and things of that nature. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Jamie.
Thank you, Walt. Going to take this clicker. My name is Jamie Oswald, like Walt said. I come from Mercy. Just a little bit of background on Mercy. So we are the Mercy health system that exists in the central United States, right? So we operate in Missouri, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Kansas. It's very likely that if you are not from one of those places, you still have a Mercy healthcare system in your area. It's a different one. Basically, nuns landed from Ireland into New York 200 years ago, moved west and planted schools and hospitals along the way. We've since consolidated up into big clumps, but we're unaffiliated except for that we both report to CMS and to the Pope. So that's our story. We're a pretty good sized organization. We've got 40,000 coworkers, 40 plus hospitals, around $5 billion in revenue. And we are, either the first or tied for first in all the markets in which we operate. Just to tell you a little bit about what we're going to go through, I'm going to tell you our perioperative story today, which is really a model for how we've expanded Hana throughout the rest of our organization. Periop was just our first and most mature offering, so that's where we're going to go. Now, don't get hung up if you don't operate surgical centers in your organization. I think you'll find that a lot of the things we're going to talk about are pretty relevant. But just quick show of hands, who in here has data in your organization? Okay, that's good. That's one point of commonality. Who in here has had a healthcare experience in their life? Okay, great. So we should have a lot to talk about. Also, if you haven't looked at the agenda, I'm on the panel right after this. So I would say hold questions for that unless you have something particularly juicy, in which case, we'll figure it out. So what are perioperative services? If you're not familiar, that is the healthcare line of business that involves operating your operating rooms, right? So it's the highest cost per discharge service line in the nation. There's a lot of supplies that gets used there, a lot of labor that gets used there, a lot of overhead that gets used there. Some of the key metrics that we look at in that space are cost per case, right? So how much does it cost us to complete a case in and out, block utilization. So this is really around the management of our asset, which is our operating rooms themselves, right? So what percentage of their day are they effectively in use? And then finally, turnaround time, right? So how quickly do we get people in and out safely, appropriately, et cetera. So some of the challenges that we had in operating on this were, first is volume, right? So we've got just a ton of data. If you can imagine how many supplies are used in an individual surgical procedure, and then put that into the 25 surgery centers across our landscape, you can imagine just how quickly that data set grows. You've also got governance, right? So up until a few years ago, most hospitals, even in large systems, ran as sort of independent entities and they did things their way. And so we had to, if we were going to benchmark across our system, we really needed them to all operate in the same way and use common language for their measures and their metrics and things like that. And then finally, dynamic grouping and filtering, right? So we had a real interest in letting our users ask questions that they couldn't previously ask. So those were the things that led us to invest in Hana in the first place 4 years ago. So just a little background, and I'm sure in government you all can sympathize with a lot of these. We never had any money, and we wanted to spend our money on stuff that wasn't technology to run the business. But in 2012, reimbursements were going down, right? So Medicare is obviously the biggest payer in the US, and they were changing the way that they were reimbursing folks. Again, our organization was inconsistently structured, right? So the way we did things in Springfield were different than the way we did them in St. Louis, which were different than the way we did them in Oklahoma City. Because those business processes were different, the measures were also different, right? So we have a concept of wasted supplies, right? Well, in Springfield, anything you open and don't use is a wasted supply. In St. Louis, for it to count as a wasted supply, you have to drop it on the floor. Which then we don't use on anybody, just to be clear. So those are considered wasted. Now you can imagine when we first put these numbers in front of people, Springfield wasn't very happy because they were taking a more aggressive view of that, so their wasted number looked worse, even though they were really closer to St. Louis than that. So just getting that definition across really matters. Data collection was very manual, right? So it was sort of a thumb. We've had 10 surgeries today. We used 20 packs of gauze, so we'll say each of them used 2, and that's not a very specific way to be able to drive behavior change. And finally, varying opinions for products, price, the way we did things. One of the key things that we recognized early in our process, and this goes beyond peri-op to all of our service lines really, was that we want to drive out clinical variation, right? Or at least make sure that when we are varying our clinical practice, it's appropriate, right? So it's not just this doctor does it this way and uses these instruments and uses these implants because that's what they learned in school. It's which is the best one, and then let's figure out how to replicate that success throughout. And so that was our big use case, was really using the data to understand that variation and understand the best way to take care of people, and then to make sure that we were implementing that best path for everybody. So why did we choose Hana in our perioperative space, right? So the 3 big ones were self-service, right? We wanted people to get to ask their questions. We wanted to deliver it to them faster, right? So we've all been part of those projects, the long-term waterfall IT projects that take 18 months to implement, and then at the end you have something for which you no longer have a business problem, right? We've been there. And finally, the speed of analysis. We just wanted to give them a much better interaction, right? So for self-service, there were a couple different tools that we used from SAP. We were an SAP shop for business objects for a long time. Before we invested in Hana. And we really like Business Objects Explorer, which if you haven't been hearing about it from your account rep, it's because it's going out of support in a couple years when Flash dies. Lumira is the new Explorer. But in Explorer at the time, it was the best tool available for us. And we wanted to be able to put bigger data sets in there, right? So without Hana behind it, you were limited to about 1 million rows, about 20 columns, in terms of the data set that you could analyze, which, again, if you think about how many individual supply items go into a procedure, is not very much, right? That took us from where we could only give them about 3 weeks worth of data to where we could put 2 years of data in their hands. They could start zipping through that. It also allowed us to give them a lower level of detail in that data, right? So before it was all sort of aggregated and roughly aggregated at that. Now we can show the individual supply that went into the individual person by an individual doctor on an individual date as part of an individual procedure, which is really powerful when you're looking to actually change the way people do things. It also allowed us to add some more complex calculations, just things that we couldn't previously put into that tool. And then to answer your questions, we are currently deploying SAP Lumira to replace Explorer, and we are evaluating the SAP Analytics Cloud as well for some of our self-service options. Speed of delivery, right? So how do we get this data in people's hands faster? Because of the nature of Hana, we don't have to pre-aggregate everything, right? So if you've been data warehousing for a while, you know that when you have data that you want to present on a dashboard, right? The first thing you do is build a huge table with all of the little pieces of data, and every time you query it, it takes forever to run, right? So then you have a roll-up table built on that table that you run a stored procedure that runs for an hour and puts it at the regional level. And then another job that puts it at the individual facility level. And then another one that puts it at the individual department level. And then when you're querying, you have to know which table do I hit, how do I do that? With Hana, you don't need to pre-build those aggregates, right? You define that low-level data, and then your change in that role is just based on which dimensions you choose to bring into your query. So in the old world, right, if somebody said, wow, I really want to change that threshold from 0.3 to 0.5, what does that look like? Well, great, I have to go change it in 4 places in the code, then I have to run all those jobs. Sometime tomorrow, I'll have that answer for you. With Hana, if it's, I want to see what changing it from 0.3 to 0.5 is, I go into that base level view, I change that number, I activate it, and then when they refresh the dashboard, they see it. It's really changed the way we can deliver it. Another thing that's fast is just loading data into it, right? So we use SAP Data Services to load data in Hana. We get around 100,000 rows a second without any sort of optimization. In fact, for the first 3 years that we used it, we didn't worry about change data capture or appending rows or whatever. We just wiped every table out and reloaded it because it was fast enough. It met all of our SLAs and we didn't need to worry about it. Now recently we've run into some tables that are bigger, so we've had to do some of those things, but it's been wonderful from that perspective. One thing to bear in mind when taking on Hana is that you will have a learning curve, right? This is a real reimagining of the way data warehouses work. And so some of your old data modelers and data architects, you really have to focus on getting them to get it, right? You need that light switch to go off in their head that says, okay, I don't need to do it the way that I've always done it. Here is the path to Nirvana or Valhalla or whichever afterlife you're going for. So just understand that you will need to be sensitive to that. You will need to build that into your timelines and just fair warning. The next is the speed of analysis, right? So because of the nature of Hana, we don't have to pre-aggregate everything, right? So in the old world, I couldn't get this much data to people. Like I had no mechanism to give it to them in any sort of meaningful way. There were some things I couldn't even run, right? Just I could let them run all day, every day, and they would plots out eventually in Oracle. Even the pre-aggregated ones, sometimes I could not get to come back. Now, because it's in memory, because I don't have it pre-aggregated, I can do dynamic grouping and filtering, right? So, even in the old world, if you had OLAP cubes, right, you were defined by the combinations of dimensions that you applied to that cube, right? So you could say, okay, which region do you want to see? But then you couldn't say, but also just for fun, I want to throw in these 3 doctors from another region because I think they do things similarly or very differently, and I want to see what that looks like together, right? Or I want to look at this data, this roll up, but I want to exclude these 3 things. Those just weren't possible, or they required a tremendous amount of effort to put into place. And with Hana, because we don't have to pre-aggregate, because we can go down to the lowest level of granularity on everything, I can let them do pretty much whatever they want inside that box that I've predefined. And they've been really, really happy. It's also, there is a lot to be said for just not having to keep calling IT, right? So in the old world, right, if you had a question, you would call decision support or IT or whoever it is that got your answers, and you would say, this is my problem, I want this data set, right? 2 weeks later, you would get the result of your ticket in the ticketing system, and you would say, gosh, that's really good. I have a follow-up question, right? So you would put in that ticket, and 2 weeks later, you would get that, and you would say, wow, that's really interesting. I have another follow-up question. And so by the time you would get all of the resources that you needed and all of the data you needed to make that decision, that's not your problem anymore, right? You moved on to having new and creative problems in that time frame because our users can now just pull up the dashboard and say, gosh, I wonder what implants Dr. So-and-so is using for this particular case, because they can just get that answer while they're sitting at their own desk without having to call anybody. It really makes it compelling, right? It really makes it so that they can use information to make their their everyday decisions instead of just their strategic ones, which has really changed the face of our business. So just a little bit about the solution that we've delivered, and I apologize, I was going to do a live demo today. The sacrifice I attempted to make to the demo gods did not work. I don't think I'm gonna get the deposit back on my hotel room either. It got a little heated, but. So for us, our enterprise standards for information delivery are Epic, which are our big electronic health record company, right? So if they deliver a metric in there, that's what we use. Very often though, we want to mash that data up, that clinical data with operational data. And when we do that, or we can't use Epic for some other reason, we go to business objects, right? So those are our two delivery methods. Some of the key components of our delivery are we always start with a HighLevel Dashboard, right? So we want to be sensitive to personas, and our first persona is always the executive that paid for it, right? So for that, we give them a tiled view, right? It's color-coded, lets them know exactly where their problem is, right? It's just here are your 6 key metrics. You can tell whether you're in trouble or not, and you can drill into it, right? So once you drill into it, we give you a guided analysis of where you want to go to next, right? So it's basically a BI expert system. When this is out of whack, we know this is the next level of detail that you want, so we go ahead and give that to you, and we'll give you 2 or 3 levels of those. Once you get down to where we don't know where you want to go, we've got 2 different directions you can go. So the first is into a detail view, right? And so this is where Explorer came in, and where we'll be replacing that with Lumira and the SAP Analytics Cloud. Is we'll let you get all the way down into the details, right? So we'll get you to where you can see the average cost per case for a given procedure in a given region, but when you want to get lower than that, we push you into Explorer. It's context aware, so it already knows what selections you've made, right? So you're not having to go and remake all of those. And we'll let you get into, okay, great, so I'm looking at Springfield, this doctor's way higher, why? And you can go into that doctor, you can see the things that they've been putting in compared to the other physicians in that practice, and you can start having those conversations about why they're using it and should they be using it and what's the best use of Mercy's resources and what takes best care of our patients. The other sort of insight we give them is a link to just a simple wiki page that has all of the information about that dashboard, right? So it says who the business sponsor is. It says who the IT developer is. It says, here's a list of all the measures, and then those are their own pages that have definitions, right? So you can go and see who defined it, what screen in Epic you have to click on to get something to show up in the numerator or denominator. If we have remediation tactics, right? So if it's something that we know how to fix it when it gets out of whack, we'll put that in there. It's been really useful, and this gives us 2 different levels of transparency, right? So who in here, when you've delivered a report to someone, their first response is, well, that's not my number, right? Show of hands, anybody? Anybody been told that's not their number? Okay. Well, you have not delivered enough data, I would argue, if you haven't had that experience. So because we have these 2 levels, if I show it to a doctor and he says that's not my number, okay, well, great, let's go look at the wiki page for the definition. Right? Here's what's included in wasted supplies. Yes, it didn't touch the floor, but you did open it and not use it, so we're including that. And you can see this is the broad definition approved by our specialty council and things like that. So now we're on the same page about what that definition is. Now we can go in and actually look at your numbers, right? So I can say, okay, so that's not your number. Which of these were not your patients? Oh, those were your patients. Great. Which of these procedures did you not perform? Oh, you performed all those procedures? Great. Which of these supplies did you not use? Oh, you used all those supplies. Well, guess what? Those are your numbers, right? It's really powerful when you can have that. When we actually rolled this out, it was the closest I've ever been to losing a job because my VP showed this off in a specialty council meeting, right? So all of the important orthopedic surgeons for Mercy were in a room. And the worst number on here was the head of that specialty council. I'm not going to name names, just in case any of you know him. And he understandably wanted to say that that was not his number. And so they spent about a half an hour playing Stump the Chump with my VP in front of all of these very important people. And they were able to prove that, yes, in fact, that was your number. And it's great because the conversations you get to have when you have this level of detail is we got down and we said, it's this Scalpel Tip that you're using, right? There's the Scalpel Tip. It costs us $500 every time you use it. You're the only one using it. Nobody else does. That's why you're more expensive than everybody else. And you know what his response was? I'll tell you. It was, I don't need to use that one. That's just what they hand me, right? Because that was what he put on his preference card 30 years ago when he first came out of grad school, or out of medical school, and he just hadn't gotten around to updating it because nobody had the information to show that to him, right? So he changed his process. All of his numbers, all of his outcomes all stayed the same except for his cost per case went down, right? So that's a win for everybody, right? Win for the patient, win for the payer, win for the health system. So just having that sort of information is amazing. Another fun example, and I know Walt likes this one. We had one location that was using twice as much antibiotic bone cement in a knee operation, right? So if you can imagine, antibiotic bone cement is expensive. You wouldn't expect so. Cement sounds cheap, but this is pricey stuff. One place was using twice as much as everywhere else. The reason they were, and we didn't know this until we physically went to their location, they had a different mixing bowl than everybody else was using. And this mixing bowl had a lip on it that required the fill-to line to be much higher, right? So they had to open a second bag just to get up to that line every time that they used the stuff. And so we said, okay, well, let's swap out the $5 bowls and start saving the $100 on every case for this stuff. Just silly stuff, but stuff that you can't uncover unless you have access to that data. And some other benefits of Hana, right? We can bring multiple data together, right? So this one screen here has data from our EMR, from our budgeting software, from our decision support software, from our ERP, from a couple of outside contracts that we bring in. And we also do some predictive stuff in here where we say, okay, if we got all of these surgeons in this list to the 50th percentile, what's the financial opportunity, right? And we do that basically, how much more are you spending than the 50th percentile? How many of these cases do you do a year? And it really lets you focus on where you can get the most bang for your buck, right? Not a horrendously complex situation technically, but it really helps our OR directors know where to target their efforts as they're going through. Again, self-service, so I've talked about that. The last thing we do in terms of delivery is we have a surgeon scorecard, right? So this is, we already have the data, we already have it modeled. Our dashboard takes care of our executive view and our OR director view. We also wanted to give something to the surgeons just so they could quickly see how they stacked up. Now, again, technically not that impressive. We took data that we already had and just presented it at a lower level of granularity and put it where they lived. But the thing that we did here was when you click on your name, it will tell you what your rank is, right? So for that particular case, you are 45th out of 50th in the system or in your practice or whatever. Now, I don't know if you know this about surgeons, but they are all super type A, super competitive. They like to win. So when you give them that information and you let them click on it and they can see the names of everybody who's better than them and everybody who's worse than them as well, it really can be a motivating factor to have them listen to you when you come and have conversations about which scalpel tips they should not be using and why they should change out their bone cement mixing bowls. Finally, just some results that we've experienced. So we were able to reduce variation in our practice, right? So here's just an example of 2 of our procedures. You can see that not only did the average come down, but it's a much tighter line, right? So it's not just that we lowered the cost, it's that we lowered the cost and we tightened it up quite a bit, which is good. In terms of raw numbers, so over the years we've saved over $33 million in peri-op and cardiology, which are the 2 targets for this, which is good, right? We've spent considerably less than that on Hana, which is good. Other areas, we saved $1 million in lab, and last year we saved $4 million in nursing, sort of by accident. We weren't planning on going after those savings aggressively, but once we got the data in here and made it available to people, they were able to cut out $4 million in nursing labor by, I won't get into the details, I don't have time, but if you're interested, ask me some of the specifics about that. But so, I like to say, and SAP I think likes to hear me say, everything I put into Hana saves me money. And it really has over the years. And it's just by enabling and empowering people with information that they need to do their jobs, right? Everybody's people have the right goals, right? They know what they want to do. And if you give them the right information, they can make the right decision, right? It's not based on their gut. It really lets them live their best life, if you can forgive the meme. In terms of lessons learned, you need support from the top and the bottom of the organization, right? So it's great if the executive wants it. If the people who actually know the inner workings of it aren't on board, you're going to have problems, and vice versa, right? The people at the bottom want it, but the executives aren't going to pay attention to it. You're not going to get very far. Choose your battles wisely, right? So go after an area where you know you can have an impact right away. That's why we chose Periop. We had tremendous executive support. We knew we had the data. Get those big wins under your belt. You have to get the data right. That doesn't mean you need to get it right on the first try. If you expose it all to them, your users will be the best, data quality people you will ever find, because when they can search down and figure out that in fact that was not their number, they will let you know very rapidly, and you can fix your integration processes. And this is just a sidebar. I say this in every presentation. A lot of analytics and BI people think that your job is to kill Excel. Excel is undefeated. Largely because, guess what, the people who pay for all this, that's their favorite tool. So get past it, figure out how to make sure that their spreadsheets start with the right data. And then finally, one thing I like as a takeaway is there's a natural analytics maturity model, right? You start with descriptive, you go to predictive, you get to prescriptive. Eventually, there's no shortcut to the top, right? If you can't accurately say what you've historically done, nobody will trust your predictions and your prescriptions. So make sure you follow the line. Now, you can go quickly through that line, right? But know that you have to get there. And with that, I will turn it back over.